The star of House Kirn. The void beyond the armored Crystal Flex viewport was not empty. It was a tapestry, a divine and brutal canvas upon which the God Emperor's will was written in fire and blood, in sacrifice and steel. For Lady Ileana Kirn, standing in the quiet, rarefied solitude of her family's observatory spire on the hive world of Cipramundi, it was not just a sight to behold. It was her birthright, her destiny, her burden. The starfields were the domain of House Kirn. For 7 centuries, since the glorious and myth-shrouded days of the Great Crusade, a scion of their line had commanded a vessel in the battle fleet Obscurus. They had fought with honor in the Gothic War, their ships a thread in the cordon that had for a time held back the Abaddon's malice. They had held the line at the Cadian Gate, a name that sent a shiver of pride and dread down any imperial commander's spine. They had sent 3 of their sons to the hallowed ranks of the Imperial Navy's officer corps, and 1 daughter, centuries past, who had died commanding a frigate against a Wog. In the Segmentum Solar, theirs was a legacy of void war, a song of plasma drives and macro-cannon broadsides sung through the generations, a chronicle etched not on parchment, but on the hulls of warships and the tombstones of heroes. Ileana, at 16 standard years, was the last of her line. Her father, Lord Captain Hector Kirn, had died 2 years prior, his cruiser, the Dauntless, torn asunder by orc freebooters in the Coronus Expanse. His death had not been a clean, heroic end in a grand fleet engagement, a tale for the picked feeds and recruitment posters. It had been a brutal, close-quarters brawl, a desperate struggle in the dark corridors of his own ship, overrun by hulking, laughing greenskins. The Navy communique had been stark, clinical, vessel lost with all hands. No wreckage recovered. It was a death that haunted Ileana, not with the cold sweat of night terrors, but with a fierce, burning determination that was a constant, low-grade fire in her chest. She would not let his legacy, their legacy, end in such ignominious silence. She would command, she would excel. She would restore the honor that had been, in her mind, sullied by the manner of his passing. The decision, therefore, was not an if, but a when. She would attend the Cipramundi Naval Academy, the very institution that had forged her father and his father before him. The academy was a city within a city, a brutalist fortress of gray adamantine and black carved stone that rose from the smog-choked underhive like a clenched fist. Its spires clawed at the perpetually twilight sky, their peaks lost in chemical clouds. The air itself tasted different here, not the perfumed, recycled atmosphere of the noble spires, but a metallic, ozone-tinged brew of promethium fumes, industrial runoff, and the faint, ever-present scent of human sweat. From the moment she passed under the great, grim archway, its stone inscribed with the motto Nec aspera terrent, hardship does not deter, Ileana felt a profound and unsettling shift in her very being. She was no longer Lady Ileana Kirn of the High Spires. She was Cadet Kirn, a single, insignificant number in the Academy's vast, grinding machine. Her worries began not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, creeping tide, seeping into the foundations of her confidence. The first and most persistent was the weight of her name. Kirn was not just a name, it was an expectation, a standard against which she would be measured, and found wanting, she was sure. Instructors, hard-faced men and women with cybernetic eyes and data ports in their temples, would look at her roster slate, their gaze flicking up to her face, and she could see the unspoken question in their flat, assessing stares. Are you the one? Are you worthy? The answer, in the first grueling months, felt like a resounding, humiliating no. She was physically slight, her body honed in dancing halls and etiquette classes, not in the grueling conditioning drills of the parade ground. She struggles left her gasping on the dew-slicked adamantine while her peers, many from generations of military families, their bodies hardened by a life of service, or the hardy scum of the underhives, forged in a crucible of violence and deprivation, barely broke a sweat. Her muscles screamed in protest, her lungs burned, and the taste of failure was as sharp and coppery as blood in her mouth. Her knowledge, so proudly cultivated in the silent, dusty sanctuary of her father's library, was starkly, brutally theoretical. She could recite the tenets of the Imperial Navy's Codex Astartes. She could name every class of ship from the mighty Emperor-class battleship to the lowly system monitor. She could diagram the firing sequence of a plasma battery. But here, Knowledge was applied with brutal, unforgiving simplicity in the cold glow of the tactical logic engines. Her first simulation, a simple convoy escort through a supposedly safe sector, ended in catastrophe. She had positioned her frigate too far ahead, seeking glory, and a surprise Drukhari raid, emerging from a nearby nebula, had fallen upon her charges like wolves among sheep. The cold, synthesized voice of the machine spirit had intoned, devoid of all emotion, mission failure, cargo and crew losses, 100%, command assessment, inadequate. The shame had been a physical blow, a hot flush that climbed from her neck to her cheeks. She had fled the simulation chamber, ignoring the muttered comments and sidelong glances of the other cadets, and retreated to her barren cell. The gray, unpainted walls felt like they were closing in, the hum of the hive city a mocking drone. Was this her destiny, to be the Kirn who broke the chain, the girl who couldn't even protect pixels on a screen, the one whose hubris got a virtual convoy of thousands slaughtered? The weight of 7 centuries of history felt like a tombstone on her chest. The social isolation was another keenly felt blade, twisting in a different way. The other cadets were a closed circle, a society with its own unspoken rules and hierarchies. The highborn sons and daughters of other military houses saw her not as a peer, but as direct competition, a rival for the coveted ship commands and prestigious postings. Their conversations were laced with a polite, cutting disdain. The cadets from common stock, the ones who had earned their place through sheer grit and examination scores, viewed her with open suspicion and resentment. She was a pampered noble, they thought, playing at being an officer, a dilettante who would eventually buy her way to a command they had bled for. Her attempts at camaraderie, at sharing a meal or discussing a tactical problem, were met with stiff, formal nods or outright dismissal. She ate her bland, nutrient-paced rations alone at the end of a long table, studied alone in a secluded carrel of the library, and lay awake at night in the stark, regimented silence, listening to the distant, industrial hum of the hive city and the louder, more insistent hum of her own doubts. Her only solace, a singular, unexpected lifeline, came in the form of a cadet named Marcus Valerius. He was from a long, unbroken line of Munitorum logisticians, a stocky, pragmatic young man with a calm demeanor and a mind that saw the Imperial Navy not as a romance of battle and glory, but as a vast, complex, and terrifyingly fragile machine of supply, demand, trajectory, and probability. He did not see Ileana as Kirn the noble or Kirn the failure. He saw her as Ileana the struggler, and in his eyes, that was a category he understood and respected. He found her one evening in the library, head buried in her arms, a complex astronavigational chart of the Cadian gate spinning uselessly on the data slate before her. "You're thinking in epics," he said, his voice quiet and matter-of-fact without a trace of mockery. He gestured at the swirling stellar cartography. "You see a grand duel between battleships, heroes crossing swords in the void. The Navy, the real Navy, runs on fuel, on ammunition, on the fact that the ship's biscuit in hold 7 doesn't arrive full of maggots, and that the crew's morale doesn't break during a 6-month warp transit. You're trying to paint a masterpiece before you've learned how to mix the pigments. Start with the logistics. The battle is the last, messy 5%. It was a revelation. Marcus helped her deconstruct the simulations, not as heroic narratives where she had to live up to her name, but as complex, interlocking problems of resource management, vector calculus, and predictive analysis. He taught her to think like the enemy, to calculate their fuel ranges, their probable objectives, their logistical weaknesses. Slowly, painfully, like a piece of crude metal being hammered on a smith's anvil, she began to improve. The failures became less catastrophic, the simulations ending in Pyrrhic victories or strategic withdrawals instead of total annihilation. She learned to channel her family's legacy not as a crushing weight of expectation, but as a foundation of principle and resolve. Her father hadn't been born a perfect commander. He had been forged into one through failure and hardship and relentless study, and so would she be. The years at the academy were a crucible, a fire that burned away the soft, uncertain girl and left in her place a woman of tempered steel. She grew harder, her soft features sharpening with resolve and the perpetual fatigue of endless drills and study. The childish light in her eyes was replaced by a watchful, analytical calm. She earned the respect of her peers not through any sudden, brilliant act of heroism, but through sheer, dogged perseverance. She was always the last to leave the simulation chambers, her uniform often stained with sweat and machine oil. She never complained, never made excuses. She simply endured, and then she improved. She graduated in the top fifth of her class, not first, not with the valedictorian honors she might have once dreamed of, but with a solid, earned record that spoke of competence and unwavering determination. As she stood at the graduation parade, her dark green cadet's uniform replaced by the stark, imposing black and gold of an Imperial Navy ensign, the braided cord of her new rank heavy on her shoulder, she felt not the triumphant, soaring glory of her childhood dreams, but a quiet, solemn certainty, cold and hard as diamond. She was ready. Her first posting was everything she had worked for, and yet, a subtle disappointment that gnawed at the edges of her resolve. She was given command of the Solitas Vigil, a Dauntless-class light cruiser assigned to the Caltine System's planetary defense squadron. It was not the front line. It was not the battle fleets mustering near Cadia, where the great enemy perpetually tested the defenses. It was quiet. It was peaceful. The Caltine system was a backwater, its primary world, Caltine Prime, an agri-world of sprawling continent-sized fungal plains and a few scattered hive spires where the planetary governance and PDF were housed. The system's only note of importance was its massive weekly exports of protein-rich fungi, which fed a dozen nearby hive worlds. The Solitas Vigil and her two sister ships, the Stalwart and the Sentinel, were the guardians of this peaceful, if vital, breadbasket. Their duties consisted of endless, mind-numbingly dull patrols along the system's shipping lanes, showing the flag to local merchant guilds, and running drill after drill after drill. For the first 6 months, the most exciting thing that happened was a minor plasma conduit rupture in the lower decks that required a team in full hazard suits to contain and reseal, an event that caused no casualties and was resolved in under 3 hours. Ileana chafed at the inactivity. This was not the glorious service of her ancestors. This was sentry duty. She drove her crew relentlessly, running battle simulations, boarding drills, and damage control scenarios until the ratings grumbled in the mess halls and her junior officers grew weary and sullen. She was preparing for a war that seemed a universe away, a phantom conflict that existed only in her memories of the academy and the stories of her house. The war, when it came, did not arrive with a grand declaration or the roaring emergence of a fleet from the warp. It arrived with a desperate, distorted astropathic shriek that tore through the quiet of the bridge, a psychic scream of pain and terror that made the ship's sanctioned astropath, a wizened man named Lorik, recoil in his throne with a whimper, a thin trickle of blood leaking from his nose. A merchant convoy, the Blessed Harvest, carrying a full season's harvest from the southern fungal plains, had gone silent mid-transit. The Solitas Vigil was the closest vessel, and Ileana ordered an immediate course change. They translated from the calm of the void into the cold, silent graveyard where the convoy had died. The ships were husks, their running lights dead, their hulls scarred not by the clean, focused energy of lance fire, but by crude, violent, physical breaches, the telltale marks of boarding claws and melta-cutters. There were no life signs, not even the faint biosignature of a rat or a low-leaf mite. The ships were tombs. The cargo holds, which should have been brimming with edible fungi, were stripped bare, leaving only scraps of mycelial webbing and the faint, decaying odor that permeated even through the void-hardened hulls. Pirates, it was the obvious conclusion. But as the Solitas Vigil surveyor teams beamed over their detailed Auspex scans and Magos Varn, the ship's aged and extensively mechanically augmented tech priest began his ritualized data sifting. A more disturbing picture emerged. He identified traces of armor plating, advanced ceramite and plasteel alloys, fused in a way that spoke of warp heat, not conventional explosives. And then he isolated a visual capture from a surviving external picorder on one of the freighters. A symbol, graffitied in what the bioscanner confirmed was human blood and promethium on a blast-scarred bulkhead, a crude, 8-pointed star. Heretics, Ileana breathed, her blood running cold in her veins. This was no mere pirate raid. This was the touch of chaos. They tracked the raiders, using the residual warp signature and engine particulates like a hunter following a spoor. The trail led to a nearby asteroid field, a dense, chaotic debris cluster left over from a planetoid's ancient, violent destruction. Hiding within the magnetic interference and the labyrinthine passages of rock and ice was a cobbled-together, blasphemous flotilla, a gutted, desecrated Firestorm-class frigate serving as the flagship, its imperial markings scored out and replaced with the 8-pointed star, flanked by 2 larger armed transports that looked like they had been welded together from a dozen different wrecks. They flew no colors she recognized from any pirate database, their hulls a patchwork of scavenged parts and vile, demonic icons that made the eyes water to look upon. "All hands battle stations," Ileana ordered, her voice calm and firm, a stark contrast to the frantic hammering of her heart against her ribs. This was it, her first true command, her first real test, not in a simulation, but in the unforgiving reality of the void. Power up void shields. Charge lance batteries, load torpedo tubes with plasma warheads. Weapons officers, acquire targeting solutions on the lead vessel. Helm, bring us about to bearing 270 Mark III. We engaged the frigate first. The battle was a brutal, chaotic, close-range brawl. The heretics fought with a feral, desperate fervor, their ships eschewing elegant tactics for sheer, aggressive brutality. They rammed and boarded as much as they shot, their vessels swarming the Solita's vigil like angry insects. Ileana's ship was faster, better armed, and far better crewed, but her opponents were numerous, reckless, and fueled by a mad faith. Alarms blared across the bridge as a boarding torpedo, evading the point defense lasers, slammed into the starboard flank with a deafening impact that shuddered through the entire hull. The shriek of tearing metal and the cacophony of small arms fire echoed up from the lower decks through the internal comms. Ileana did not hesitate. Donning her officer's carapace armor and grabbing a las pistol and the power sword of House Kirn from its mount beside her command throne, she led the counterboarding action herself. She would not command from an insulated throne while her crew fought and died in the corridors of her ship. The scene that greeted her in the starboard access corridor was a nightmarish tableau of flashing red strobes, acrid smoke, and the screams of the wounded and the dying. Her armsmen, clad in heavy flak armor, fought with disciplined volleys of las fire against a horde of shrieking, emaciated cultists in tattered robes and scavenged void suits, their faces contorted with fanatical rage. And then he appeared. He emerged from the smoke like a phantom of legend, a giant among mortals, a figure of ancient nightmare given terrifying form. He stood a full head taller than the tallest of her armsmen, encased in power armor of blasphemous black and burnished, tarnished gold, scarred and etched with vile, pulsating runes that seemed to drink the light. A horned helmet, fashioned into the visage of a demonic hound, snarled from atop his massive shoulders, and in his hands he wielded a massive, roaring chain axe that screamed with a demonic, hungry intelligence. The symbol on his shoulder pad was unmistakable, a brand of ultimate treachery, the twisted, malevolent eye of the Black Legion. A Chaos Space Marine, one of the fallen angels, the traitor legions that had turned from the Emperor's light 10,000 years ago. The very air in the corridor grew cold and thick with a palpable malice. The shrieks of the cultists rose to a fever pitch of adoration. He moved with an impossible fluid speed, a predator unleashed. His chain axe chewed through 2 armsmen before they could even level their weapons, reducing ceramite and flesh to a fine, bloody mist. Lasbolts spattered harmlessly against his ancient, cursed armor, leaving only faint scorch marks. He was a force of nature, an engine of destruction made flesh and steel, and he was carving a path directly towards the bridge, a living, battering ram of heresy. Ileana's mind, for a single, paralyzing second, went blank. All her training, all her lineage, all her studied calm evaporated, screaming one single primal instinct, survive. She raised her las pistol and fired, the shots pinging off his chest plate like glowing insects. He didn't even seem to notice. his head turned, the red, hate-filled lenses of his helmet fixing on her, the officer, the leader, the symbol of imperial authority. A little queen on her little throne, a distorted, vox-filtered voice grated, each syllable dripping with contempt. Your skull will make a fine offering to the gods of ruin. He charged. Time seemed to slow, to stretch into a horrifying eternity. Ileana saw the dying forms of her crew, the glint of the blasphemous icons on the traitor's armor, the certain, agonizing death that approached. She saw her father's face, not as he was in life, but as he might have been in his final moments. She saw the long, unbroken line of Kirns stretching back through history, all of them watching. They had not died quietly in their beds. They had died on the deck, fighting. She stood her ground. As the Marine lunged, his chain axe raised for a decapitating blow, she dropped to one knee and slid under the wide, roaring swing, the whirling teeth ripping through the air where her head had been with a sound like a dying world. She came up behind him, firing her last pistol point-blank into the small of his back, aiming for the power cabling that Magos Varn's schematics had predicted was a potential weak point in the older Mark IV power armor's lower back articulation. It was a desperate, futile gesture. The shots sizzled against the armor, doing no visible damage. But it made him turn, his rage now focused entirely, exclusively on her. With a snarl of pure annoyance, he backhanded her, the powered gauntlet catching her on the shoulder and sending her crashing against a bulkhead like a rag doll. Agony exploded through her ribs. Her vision swam with black spots. She tasted the iron-rich flavor of her own blood in her mouth. Through blurred, pain-filled eyes, she saw it. The Magos had been right. During a full overhead swing, the armor plates at the base of the spine separated slightly, exposing a vulnerable bundle of cables. She had hit it, but not enough. He was raising his axe again, this time for a final, downward crush. For the Emperor, for the Solita's vigil, a voice roared. Sergeant Kirn, her grizzled, dependable chief armsman, slammed into the Marine's side with the last of his strength, his crackling power maul crashing against the traitor's helmet. It was a suicide attack. The blow sparked and fizzled, but the Chaos Marine merely shrugged him off, as a man might shrug off a bothersome insect, and with a contemptuous, backhanded sweep, drove his chain axe through Kirn's chest in a horrific spray of blood and shattered ceramite. But it was the distraction Ileana needed. Pushing through the blinding pain, she scrambled to her feet, her hand closing not on her last pistol, but on a discarded thermal charge from a fallen combat engineer. With fumbling, blood-slicked fingers, she primed it, set the timer for 3 seconds, and as the Marine turned back to her, Kirn's body sliding from his weapon, she threw it. It wasn't an aimed throw. It was a desperate, underhand lob, a final, defiant act. It clattered against his chest plate and stuck, held fast by its magnetic clamp. The Marine looked down, a split second of confusion visible in the slight tilt of his horrific helmet. Then the world turned white and hot. The explosion threw Ileana back down the corridor, the concussive wave slamming the air from her lungs. When her hearing returned, it was to a high-pitched, constant ringing. The smoke cleared slowly, revealing a scene of utter devastation. Where the Chaos Marine had stood was a ruined, smoldering crater in the deck, the adamantine warped and glowing. The giant was on his knees, his chest plate a mangled, blackened ruin, black blood and thick, dark oil leaking from the gaping wound. With a final, grating, mechanical sigh, the hellish red light in his eye lenses died, and he slumped forward, his massive form crashing to the deck, motionless. The remaining cultists, seeing their demigod fall, let out wails of despair and broke, only to be swiftly cut down by the vengeful armsmen. The victory was Pyrrhic. A third of her crew was dead or wounded. The ship was badly damaged, with multiple hull breaches and failing systems, but they had won. They had survived. As Ileana stood, leaning heavily against the scarred and blood-slicked bulkhead, breathing in the acrid scent of ozone, promethium, and blood, she felt a grim, exhausted satisfaction settle in her bones. She had been tested in the most fundamental way possible. She had faced one of the universe's ultimate horrors, and she had not broken, she had held. That feeling curdled into icy, gut-wrenching dread hours later, when a pale and shaken Magos Varn was ushered onto the bridge. The tech priest had managed to partially decrypt the data core salvaged from the dead Marine's armor, a task that had required rituals of purification and the burning of sacred incense to ward off the data taint. "The vessel we engaged was a scout, Captain," the Magos intoned, his mechanical voice a low, whirring monotone devoid of all human emotion, which made the news even more terrifying. "A vanguard, a probe. This data core contains fragmented navigational data and a single, repeating astropathic identifier. It is a rallying beacon, a homing signal." He turned his glowing red optical lenses towards her, the mechanical orbs clicking faintly as they focused. "The beacon originates from a fleet, a large fleet. The identifier code, it corresponds to the vengeful spirit, the despoiler's own flagship, the throne of the archfiend himself. Abaddon the Destroyer is coming here. This is not a raid. It is the spearhead of his next Black Crusade, and the Caltain system is his intended anvil." The bridge fell into a silence more profound and terrifying than any battle clamor. Abaddon, the archfiend, the great enemy, whose name was a curse spoken in whispers. His Black Crusades were events of galactic catastrophe, each one tearing a bloody wound in the Imperium that took centuries to heal, and he was coming here, to their quiet, forgotten agri-world. Ileana's mind, still aching from her injuries, raced through the implications, the tactical realities. They were a speed bump, a footnote. "Astropath," she commanded, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Send a message to Battlefleet Obscurus Command. Maximum priority, Cipher, the gate is breached. Inform them of the Black Legion's vanguard and the approach of the vengeful spirit. Detail the enemy strength we encountered. Request immediate, heavy reinforcement." The astropath, the withered Lorik, nodded, his blind eyes rolling back in his head as his mind reached out across the impossible, chaotic distances of the Imperium, sending the desperate plea into the warp. The response came back days later, a psychic echo that was weak, strained, and left the man weeping tears of blood from his empty sockets. "Reinforcements dispatched. Elements of the battle fleet and the Adeptus Astartes are en route. Estimated time of arrival, 84 hours. Hold the line, the Emperor protects." 84 hours. They had just over 3 days, and the long-range auger arrays were already painting a terrifying, impossible picture. A tear in reality was forming at the system's edge, a wound in the fabric of space that bled the unholy, eye-searing light of the warp. And from that raging, colorful storm, ships began to emerge. Not pirate scum, not a single cobbled-together frigate. A full battle group of the Black Legion, their silhouettes sharp and malevolent against the psychic maelstrom. There were 3 of them, a Carnage-class cruiser, its hull a fanged maw of weapon batteries and launch bays. A Slaughter-class cruiser, its lines sleek and predatory, built for speed and the gruesome, close-in slaughter its name implied. And leading them, a massive, hulking Desolator-class battleship, a floating fortress of death that dwarfed the Solita's Vigil, its lance batteries alone as large as her entire vessel. 3-1. An impossible, horrifying odds. Her 2 sister ships, the Stalwart and the Sentinel, moved to form a ragged battle line with her. Their captains, both older, more experienced men who had once looked upon their young female commander with a degree of patronizing doubt, now looked to her on the vid-picked feed. Their faces were grim, etched with the same cold fear she felt. She was, by rank, and by the grim authority of her recent, hard-won victory, the senior officer. "They will be here in 6 hours," Ileana said, her voice ringing with a clarity and strength that surprised even her. There was no fear in it now, only purpose. The time for doubt was past. "Reinforcements in 84. Our orders are to hold the line. We cannot allow this fleet to reach Caltain Prime. We cannot allow them to bombard the planet, to establish a beachhead, to use it as a staging ground for the despoiler." She looked at the tactical slate, at the 3 blood-red icons closing in on their 3 lonely, defiant blue ones. A direct, stand-up engagement was instant suicide. A fighting retreat would only lead the enemy directly to the planet they were sworn to protect. There was only one strategy, one that every fiber of her being, every lesson from Marcus, every story of her house, told her was the only way. "We make our stand here at the Manville Point," she declared, her voice flat and final. "We do not let them pass. We bleed them. We slow them down. We make them pay for this system in time and in blood. For every second we buy, for every hour we hold, the reinforcements from the battle fleet have a better chance of arriving in time to save the billions of souls on Caltine Prime. We are the anvil upon which their advance will be broken. Let us be a hard one. The final battle was a brief, brutal and beautiful ballet of destruction set to a symphony of screaming metal, exploding consoles and dying crew. The Solita's vigil fought with the cold, precise fury of the doomed. Ileana, strapped into her command throne, her body a canvas of pain, wove her ship through a storm of incandescent lance fire and swarming plasma torpedoes, her orders sharp, precise, and unyielding. They focused their fire on the Carnage-class cruiser, the fastest of the enemy trio, aiming for its engine nacelles. A full, coordinated broadside from their lance batteries found its mark, shearing off one of its primary propulsion units in a spectacular, silent detonation, sending the vessel listing away from the battle, crippled but not dead. But the return fire was utterly devastating. The stalwart was the first to die. Its void shields, overwhelmed by a concentrated barrage from the massive desolator, collapsed in a shower of dissipating energy. A moment later, a full volley of macro-cannon shells, each the size of a ground tank, tore into its hull. The ship didn't so much explode as come apart, its spine broken, its plasma drive overloading in a silent, blossoming star of light that momentarily outshone the system's sun. The Sentinel died next, rammed amidships by the Slaughter-class cruiser after a valiant but futile close-range broadside. The two ships became a single, tangled wreck, spinning helplessly, secondary explosions ripping them apart from the inside out like a string of firecrackers. Now it was just the Solita's vigil, alone and wounded, against the two remaining, largely intact Chaos vessels. Their own void shields failed under the relentless pounding. The hull buckled and screamed around them. A direct hit to the bridge killed her helmsman, her tactical officer, and half her command staff. Ileana, thrown from her command throne by the blast, felt the air turn to fire as a console exploded beside her, showering her with shrapnel. She dragged herself up, one arm hanging uselessly, her face a mask of blood and soot, her vision blurred. "Report," she coughed, the word tasting of smoke and iron. "Port weapons batteries destroyed, life support failing on decks 3 through 9, primary power conduit ruptured. We are dead in the water, Captain, engines are offline." A surviving lieutenant yelled over the roar of alarms and the terrifying, sucking sound of a void breach somewhere close by. Through the cracked, spider-webbed main viewport, she saw the enemy ships moving in for the final kill. They were slowing. They wouldn't waste another torpedo or lance shot. They were going to board, to take her ship as a prize, to take her, a naval officer and a scion of a loyalist house, as a trophy for their dark gods. She thought of the data core, of the dead Chaos Marine. They could not have it. They could not have her. They could not have this ship. She looked at the few remaining, wounded crew on the bridge. They looked back at her, their faces pale, smudged with grime and blood, but their eyes were resolute. They knew. They all knew what came next. "Magos Varn," Ileana said, her voice a ragged, broken whisper, yet it carried through the chaos. "Override all safeties. Reroute all remaining power, emergency, life support, everything, to the plasma drive. Set the core for catastrophic overload, on my command." The tech priest, half his mechanical body fused and sparking from his station, nodded, his remaining organic eye holding a strange, almost serene acceptance. The machine spirit is willing. It sings its death song. It understands the necessity. The Omnissiah awaits its return. Ileana keyed the shipwide vox, her breath rattling in her chest. "All hands," she broadcast, her voice echoing through the few sections of the ship that still had power, through the med bays, the engineering spaces, the sealed compartments where crew waited for the end. "This is the captain. We have fought with honor. We have held the line. Our duty is not yet done. Prepare to receive the enemy. Make them pay for every deck, for every corridor, for every single step they take on this, our ship. And know this in your hearts, as I know it in mine. The Emperor is with us this day. We will meet again, in glory, at the foot of his golden throne." She drew her power sword, the ancestral blade of House Kirn, its blue energy field flickering defiantly in the dying light of the bridge. The rest of the bridge crew, those who could still stand, armed themselves with lasguns, wrenches, and combat knives, forming a final grim circle around the command dais. The boarding claws hit with the sound of the world ending, a series of massive, resonant clangs that shuddered through the dying ship. The Chaos Marines poured in, black giants amidst the smoke and ruin, their bolters roaring. They met a wall of las fire and the desperate, final, sublime courage of mortals who had chosen their end. One by one, her crew fell. Ileana fought with a grace and fury drawn from the very depths of her soul, from 7 centuries of Kirn history. Her power sword, a relic of a more noble age, carved through a traitor's arm, the energy field severing ceramite, flesh, and bone. But she was hopelessly outmatched, a mortal dueling demigods. A bolt round took her in the leg, shattering the bone and sending her crashing to the deck. She fell to one knee, using her sword to prop herself up. A black legionnaire, his armor more ornate than the others, adorned with grisly trophies of skin and bone, stood over her. He raised his bolter, its barrel pointed directly at her face. "A fitting end for a servant of the corpse emperor," he snarled, his voice a symphony of hatred. "Oblivion." Ileana looked past him, through the cracked viewport, at the 2 enemy ships looming so close they filled the entire frame, their own hulls scarred and pitted from the fight. She smiled then, a bloody, defiant gesture that held no fear, only a final, absolute victory. "The line is held," she whispered. And with the last of her strength, she plunged the hilt of her power sword into the final, glowing override control on the side of her command throne. For a microsecond, there was absolute profound silence, as if the universe itself held its breath. Then, from the heart of the Solita's vigil, deep within its engineering decks, the contained star of its plasma drive burst its bonds. It consumed the ship in an instant, a ravening, annihilating light that vaporized decks, corridors, and the brave souls still fighting within. The energy, with nowhere else to go, shot back along the boarding claws, flooding into the 2 Chaos vessels nestled against it. The Slaughter-class cruiser and the mighty Desolator-class battleship were engulfed, their own warp-tainted reactors detonating in a chain reaction of unimaginable violence. The darkness of the void was banished by a new, ferocious, short-lived sun, a silent, expanding sphere of pure holy fire that scoured the battlefield clean of the taint of chaos. When the light faded, there was nothing left but an expanding, cooling cloud of gas and microscopic debris, a silent testament to sacrifice. 84 hours later, a task force of Imperial Navy warships, led by a gray-hulled, angel-winged Astartes battle barge of the Dark Angels chapter, translated into the Caltine system. They found no enemy fleet. They found only the echoes of a titanic battle, the scorched marker of a last stand, and a system and a planet that lived because of it. There was no body to recover for the crypts of House Kirn, no trophy to place beside the empty sarcophagus of her father. But a new name was inscribed on the roll of honor at the Cipra Mundi Naval Academy, etched in gold beside that of Hector Kirn, and a new story was told to the wide-eyed cadets in the hushed halls, the story of Ensign Ileana Kirn of the Solita's Vigil, who held the line against the great enemy himself, and in her death had bought the Imperium a precious, vital victory. The star of House Kirn had not faded. It had gone supernova, and its light, a beacon of ultimate sacrifice, would burn in the annals of the Imperial Navy until the end of time. Necaspera Tarrant, hardship had not deterred her, it had forged her, and in the end, it had been her final, glorious weapon, the Emperor indeed protected.